Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real Estate Right Now, where we talk about real estate matters that matter to you. My name is Jay Izzo, and we are live here from Linda Craft Team Studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina, part of the Research Triangle Park of North Carolina. Today's show, North Carolina is a bit unique when it comes to our contracts, honestly, and it has been said, and I don't know if it's really true. My guess is probably going to help me out with this a little bit, but typically we're about one of 13 states that handles real estate the way we handle it here in the state of North Carolina. There's been a lot of questions as to whether North Carolina is truly a pro-buyer state or a pro-seller state. Well, we're going to try to do our best to answer that question as best as we can here on today's show. So I'm bringing back Tony Fink. He is a listing and buying expert here at Linda Craft and Team Realtors here in Raleigh. Tony, welcome back to the show.
Jay, thanks for having me back. It's been a while. I love being back.
It depending on when you're watching the show. It could be right away. It could be a little bit later down the road. Is how it could be. But yeah, but good for you. Good for you. We don't know when you're viewing on DBTV or listening to us on podcasts, but whatever that may be for you, you have a lot of choices. You chose us. Thank you for doing that. We really do appreciate it.
It's actually always a pleasure to be with you, Jay.
Yeah,
so thank you for the invite.
Yeah, no, it was great. All right, so we've been in real estate combined, over 30 some odd years combined, maybe more, 40, closer to 40 years real estate, maybe even closer to 50.
I think it's closer to 60.
Yeah, it's closer to 50.
Let's
stop right there. It's been a long time, our combined real estate knowledge. But our state is a bit unique when compared to other states when they conduct.
Everybody says it's pro-seller, Jay.
Well, this is what I was going to say to you. When I came up here in real estate and got my real estate license, it seemed like everything was geared towards the as more pro seller, right? Everything that we have going on, because we're non-title state, et cetera, so forth. So are we pro seller?
It's a great question, Jay. I'm going to advocate and say that we're pro buyer in a couple key components, which may seem counterintuitive, especially what's transpired in the last couple years with rapid appreciation in housing in general, primarily driven by the pandemic. We're speaking about the triangle area of North Carolina, which has some unique characteristics to it: job growth, income growth, population growth. But most people would tell you it's kind of a pro-seller state. I'm going to argue and advocate it could be very much a pro-buyer state.
Okay. All right.
Or at minimum neutral.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting take on it. So you have a contract in front of you, right?
I have all 16 pages of our standard form, offer to purchase and contract.
So you have a contract in front of you here. And I know that in your research that you've done, you really thought about this a great deal. So maybe help the listener understand.
Let me set the stage for why it could be conceived as pro-seller. Okay. And for the most part, North Carolina is a state that's in demand for buyers. Okay. Buyers have demand for here. Yeah. So you could argue sellers have a little bit of an upper hand. But our contract has this crazy concept called a due diligence fee.
Right.
And that due diligence fee can really trip up a lot of people moving to the area. It requires some thought and some softening and some understanding, which is what we're going to discuss today, on why it's there in the first place and what it truly does. But those numbers are all negotiable. Everything in a real estate contract is negotiable except the words in this contract. But the numbers are negotiable, the amount of the due diligence fee. So let me expand the due diligence fee. It's not a deposit.
Right.
Due diligence fee. It is a check that a buyer will write to a seller. Could be a wire transfer, could be, cash, never cash. But what that does is once the seller accepts the contract, that money is due. That money is never seen again by the buyer in most circumstances, unless and until they purchase the home. And then it's credited to part of the down payment, the purchase price. If it exceeds the amount of down payment your lender requires, if you're using lender financing, you'll get it back at closing. Okay.
So due diligence is something that has been really fairly recent, but in our area. And I'm not sure how many other states do due diligence because
it's a handful. It's not many.
Right. Because typically we see in real estate, I think our prior real estate contract, right? We didn't have due diligence. Instead, you put earnest money down.
So we still have earnest money.
Okay, so we got both.
So we got both. And let's talk about the difference.
Yeah.
So the due diligence fee, as I said before, is a fee paid to the seller, which when you close on the house is credited to the purchase price.
Right.
So you don't lose it. Okay. If you close. If you walk away for any or no reason, then you forfeit those funds. The earnest money deposit, word being deposit, not fee, is typically held by a law firm representing the buyer, and they're acting as an escrow agent. And those funds are technically refundable until the end of the due diligence period. So the due diligence period in North Carolina is akin to an inspection period in other states, period of time during which the purchaser of the home under contract has the right and the seller has to cooperate with inspections of the home to make sure the condition of the home is as anticipated when the contract was accepted.
Okay, so you can maybe get your due diligence fee back.
Earnest money or due diligence?
Well, the due diligence, right? Because
you can get your due diligence fee back in very rare circumstances if a seller breaches their obligation in the contract, or if they've committed fraud, which you can prove.
Okay, so the inspection, though, if the inspection, you don't want to buy the home because the inspection's bad, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get your due diligence back.
It 100% means you're not getting your due diligence fee back.
So you have to be committed.
Yes.
As a buyer.
What I tell all my clients, both buyers and sellers, nobody puts a home under contract for sport. It's serious business. This is 16 pages, a couple thousand words of contract terms. Agents are very experienced and knowledgeable of what the terms mean and say. Some buyer clients, some seller clients will read it, but they don't spend a lot of time on it.
Right.
So to Jay's point, if you don't like the condition of the home, if the home for some reason doesn't appraise, if you wake up and the sky's blue and you thought it was going to be raining and you change your mind, the due diligence fee is forfeited. Just assume you're not getting that money back.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this, though, about due diligence, because I think this is a question that people who are moving into this area may have. And that is, how much due diligence do you generally put down? Is there a percentage?
It's a great question. There's no analytics. Everything is negotiable. Price is negotiable. Due diligence fee is negotiable. Earnest money, if you choose to put it up, earnest money deposit is negotiable. Closing date is negotiable. Whether or not the drapes are included is negotiable. However, you're asking a great question. We are in a rising market. It is important to know what the supply demand characteristics of your market are. In 2018, I put a house under contract for a buyer, helping them get their first house under contract. And we put down $1,500.
Okay.
That same house today, minimum expected due diligence fee would be $7,500.
Okay.
Probably closer to $10,000.
Okay.
Now, again, that's a lot of money, but if you think of it as a buyer as part of your down payment, then it is what it is, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's helping you get the home under contract. We should talk about what does the due diligence fee do?
Right. Yeah.
So what it does for a seller is the worst thing that can happen to a seller is they accept your contract, they make their moving plans, the mover's scheduled, they're moving into their house, they've rented an apartment, they've quit their job, or whatever it is, and you pull the contract and you don't close. So from that perspective, the due diligence fee, and I can read the actual definition of it, but the due diligence fee gives a seller certainty of execution. What does that mean? It gives the the seller a sense of confidence that the buyer will show up for closing. Okay.
Okay. Now, back to our initial premise that we're
why is it a pro buyer state?
Right, because we just
made it sound terrible.
You made it sound like, okay, my gosh, this sounds like all in the favor of the seller.
Right.
But the contention is, no, hold it here. We're pro buyer state. So how do we flip that script?
Well, let me answer for you, and let me answer the one question you asked, which I didn't answer. So most agents will be able to give you really good advice on what the due diligence fee should be as a percentage of the purchase price, relative to the characteristics of the house.
Okay.
How long it's been on market, how desirable, things of that nature.
Right.
My running total right now is about 3% of the purchase price.
Okay.
The larger the home price, the lower the percentage.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
At some point, it just becomes numbers.
Okay.
Okay. But Tony, why did you start off by saying it's a pro buyer state?
Yeah.
So Jay, let's use an analogy. You got two beautiful coffee mugs here.
Yes, I do. No coffee in them.
And well,
it's a shame.
We're not caffeinated, but we're still educated.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So we say.
So let's say those were in. They're probably not a good analogy, but let's say they were the rarest Fabergé coffee mugs in existence.
Bought them at Tiffany's.
Bought at Tiffany's, used by czars.
Right.
I mean, like irreplaceable. And let's say they're worth $500,000.
Okay.
So Jay, if I'm going to give you a contract for those coffee mugs, are you going to allow me to just change my mind and walk away?
Well, I mean, if you're going to give me a contract, I don't want to just let you walk away from them.
Exactly. So the North Carolina Standard Form Offer to Purchase and Contract has a very interesting provision, which is extremely pro buyer, not seller, which is, Jay, if I default on my obligation to buy those beautiful Tiffany coffee mugs,
right,
your only recourse to me is to keep whatever money I've given you. Due diligence fee, earnest money deposit, if there is an earnest money deposit, and if we're through the inspection period. Okay. Let's talk about the seller.
Okay.
If you decide you don't want to give me those coffee mugs, even though you've entered into a contract for those $500,000 coffee mugs,
right,
and I've given you money for those, Jay, guess what my recourse is? And I am from Jersey, so I'm not going to bring those recourses up. My recourse is a legal term, and I'm not playing an attorney. I'm not allowed to do that.
Right.
Specific performance. I can sue you and take you to court to deliver on your obligation in your agreement by contract to sell me those coffee mugs for the agreed upon price.
Okay.
So when a house goes under contract in North Carolina, the seller is at a pretty significant disadvantage because all they have to hang their hat on, all they get to keep, all they can drink coffee from is the cash that you have that's non-refundable.
Got it.
Okay. It's referred to in the contract as liquidated damages.
Okay.
Which is another legal term, which basically says, if I don't do what I contractually told you I'm going to do, keep it.
Okay.
But you can't sue me.
Right. Okay. So it in essence, it keeps the legal side kind of out of it, is what it does. And so it actually is protective.
It's extremely protective because think of it this way. If I had a $500,000 Ferrari, right, I'm not going to agree to a contract that allows you to disappear.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the one thing, and we're getting a little technical, but that's the one thing that's important to understand when you're buying or selling in North Carolina or in whatever state you're in, is if either party breaches, what is the remedy the other party has? Specific performance is a very strong remedy, which means I can hire a bunch of attorneys. Maybe I can hire an attorney that'll work on, a percentage of the award as opposed to paying them. And I can sue you to show up and deliver me the property. And there's other provisions in the contract. The property has to be in same or better condition and all these other things. As a buyer, I can tell you I don't like your haircut and I'm not buying your house, and too bad.
But you just lose the due diligence at that point.
And I lose the due diligence and or the earnest money.
And then there's also no legal action after that as well.
That's all they can do.
That's all that can be done at that point. So it really does, in essence, it does kind of protect both parties, but it really does also kind of keep the whole legal system out of the situation altogether.
Yeah. And the other point behind it and why it was created, and again, I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent, right? My job is to help people buy homes or sell homes given the contract formats that we have. It was originally set up and intended to compensate the seller for the period of time during which the house was under contract, 30 to 45 days. They're going to have mortgage payments, insurance payments, light bills, lawn bills, whatever. But the other thing that happens is if a house comes back to market that went under contract, you've missed the other buyers that were likely buyers when it went under contract. And now there's a potential for stigma What's wrong with that house?
Mm.
Why did it fall out of contract?
Mm.
Right. So a seller can incur economic harm
Right.
when a contract does not go to closing.
Right. Sure. Okay. All right. So in our state, when I got my license way back when, okay, in the 90s, um, we were told in real estate school that we represented the seller, is who we represented, unless we have this little card signed that says, that we're working with a buyer. Let's talk about, because typically what happens when people come from out of state here, and we had this working with agents,
Working with real estate agent brochure.
right? It's a brochure, and we have to present that, is something that we have to do, that people don't know, is that we are actually have to present this to a buyer.
Correct.
Right. And matter of fact, there's stories of undercover people from the real estate commission who were acting as a buyer, and the real estate agent did not offer.
And what's the reason for that document, right?
Right.
So I actually think, and I've bought and sold homes in a lot of states, North Carolina is actually a very good state for people to buy or sell real estate. The working with real estate agents is a consumer protection document. There's one for buyers, there's one for sellers. And what it does for the consumer, which is what the North Carolina Real Estate Commission is focused on, which is consumer awareness, information, and safety. It focuses the client, the consumer, on what is the role and the responsibilities of that particular agent. So as a consumer, you walk into an open house or you walk into a builder sales center, you want to know whose interests the other party you're talking to represents.
Right.
And then it gets a little more technical. Once you are in a relationship with a client, you actually have legal obligations to disclose information to them that you learn from other sources, i.e. buyers who walk in.
Right.
So that's what that document's about.
Well, and again, I think it may go towards your point of being a pro buyer state, because actually that working with real estate agents little card is actually a protective mechanism for them, because we have some things that some states don't have: a designated agency, dual agency, right? And then of course, individual representation. And we have to basically educate anybody who comes into this area, and purchase, right, what those are.
Correct, for sure. So as an agent in North Carolina, you have responsibilities to your client, which are your primary responsibilities. You also have responsibilities to the other party as well with respect to certain things. You can't misrepresent facts,
right,
and things of that nature. But yes, if you are looking to purchase in North Carolina, having an agent who is working exclusively for you as your agent, right? Those words, your representative, it's fiduciary obligation.
Right.
That's very powerful, and that does protect the consumer, protects the buyer in your circumstance.
Yeah, right. Because now the buyer actually has a document that they can keep, that, and also
the document's a disclosure,
right?
So it says what our relationship will be. To codify or to actually cement that relationship, we actually have to enter into an agency agreement.
Yeah.
And Jay's bringing up a really good point, which is, if you were to walk in an open house and there was an agent from the firm who's the sign out front, unless you ask them to represent you, they have in most instances a legal obligation to represent a seller subagent,
right?
The seller. So when you walk in, and Jay, and tell me that the house that I'm holding the open house at, I should first disclose who I represent.
Right.
And I should first disclose, which I would, the opportunity for us to work together unless I represent the sellers. And if that case, I'm going to be very direct in telling you I represent the sellers.
Right.
Okay. But you just need to know, whatever you share with them, if they're not representing you, they have an obligation to share that up the tree.
Right. Right. And the same is true of new homes. Like you go into a new home community, right, and you have a new home representative there. They don't have a fiduciary. If you don't sign anything, they don't have a fiduciary responsibility to you as a buyer.
Yeah, if you walk into a builder sales center, and no disrespect to builders or builder sales center agents, some aren't agents. They're not licensed agents.
Right.
Some are a different sales
That's
associates
correct.
or different things.
That's correct.
Just presume that they represent the interests of the seller, and their legal obligation is to get the best price and terms for the seller.
Right.
When a buyer agent's responsibility is to get the best price and terms for the buyer.
Which, and again, we're not trying to disrespect a new home community or builders or anything like that. That's not the case. But having a buyer's representative, even for a new home,
mission critical.
Is mission critical.
And most builders will tell you, and most experienced builder agents will tell you that they would prefer that a buyer have their own independent agent.
Right.
Just makes the process go smoother. Make sure there's no confusion. Make sure there's no lack of clarity on who's doing what. So builders will, if they do provide introductions, which I've had quite a few over the years, they will introduce a minimum of 3 brokers to an unrepresented buyer and say, these are 3 brokers or 5 brokers that I've worked with in the past that know our product, our process. I don't care who you work with, call one of them.
Yeah, because it's really hard to, as a buyer, walking into a new home and thinking that you can be represented by whoever's at the buyer's.
Yep.
How are you going to negotiate? How does that person negotiate against themselves, right? Because that's what you're asking them to do. And so in these cases, even in an open house, which is similar, right? You're not able to have leverage in negotiations. I think at least I would think you'd lose some of that.
You certainly can, and there's no disadvantage, at least in North Carolina, to having a buyer agent represent you, because in most instances they're going to be compensated by the transaction, so it's going to be paid out of the commission, and typically that commission is paid for by the seller. So there is some advantages there. But I'll give you a real life example, Jay. I had a property a couple months ago. It was a coming soon. Very desirable property, very desirable area. And I got a phone call from a licensed mortgage professional asking to see the home. I'm going to say, well, that's interesting. I appreciate you calling. Thank you so much. I represent the sellers.
Right.
Are you thinking for yourself? Yes. So to be clear, you're an unrepresented buyer. Yes. I would like to introduce you to a couple agents who could represent you as a buyer's agent. Tony, I appreciate that very much. Because of my position and what I do, I prefer to be an unrepresented buyer. Every communication I have with this individual, who also previously had been a licensed real estate agent and is an active real estate investor, was, Jay, just as we discussed before, I represent the sellers. My job is to get the best price and terms for them. What's your question? Right. And it was a consistent reminder of the disclosure, because unfortunately or fortunately, what happens in any negotiation is familiarity. You begin to become familiar with each other, and you want to be careful not to breach or cross any lines of who you actually represent. So I don't know if that helps explain.
I think it does. And you brought up the word disclosure, and I want to bring up another piece of this contract, which is the seller property disclosure, because is that pro seller or is that pro buyer or is it somewhere in between?
I'm going to argue that the residential property disclosure is pro buyer.
Okay.
And that's based on working with sellers.
Okay.
And I'm going to explain the document in generalities, but if you want to learn more about it, please reach out. I can walk you through it and talk you through it. It's 4 pages long. It's 37 questions. The questions are answered to the best of the knowledge of the sellers, and there is no requirement for knowledge. They're not required to go out and find out things.
Right.
But the way the questions are answered, and these questions for the audience are pretty straightforward, but fundamentally important questions. Are there problems with the roof? Are there problems with the foundation? Is there any leased property on the property? Is there, it goes down the list. And when the sellers are completing the form, which an agent is required to assist them in doing, so it's not, here's the form, call me when you completed it, right? Because, hey, Jay, are your pipes polybutylene? Are they plastic? Are they PEX? Or are they copper? What?
Yeah.
Right? So, they're not left to their own devices, but I'm a big believer in humanity. And I find most sellers have 1, pride of ownership.
Sure.
2, pride of reputation. and 3 are just good people. So they take those questions to heart and they do their best job. But they can answer it. Yes, I've got a problem. The roof is leaking.
Right.
Which then we'd advise them to fix the leak before we go on the market.
Right.
No, I don't have a problem, which is what you find most often. And then there's a third one, no representation. And no representation, depending on the nature of who the seller is, can either be a tell to a possible problem area, or it could just be no representation.
Right. Because I mean, somebody who, let's say, is elderly or has got a disability,
An estate,
and they cannot get into the crawl space or they can't climb up on the roof, they may have to just say, listen, I don't have anything that's actively doing anything, but I don't know.
Correct.
So but I can't say one way or another because I'm incapable of being able to check it. So I'm going to safely just say no representation.
Right. And when I represent buyers, I let them know that no representation means the following: either I don't know,
right,
or I choose not to tell you.
Right.
Depending on where that box is checked, an experienced agent can have their spidey sense go up a little bit.
Right.
Okay. Unless the person happens to be an attorney, and it's going to be all no representation on everything.
Right.
Right. Or if it's an estate where the seller, who's the executor, hasn't lived there, no representation. Okay. Or they haven't lived in the house for a while, typically will be no representation. They're not trying to, air quotes, pull a fast one on anyone.
Right.
They are just saying to you guys, look, I don't know. And the way the offer to purchase contract in North Carolina works is it gives you, the buyer, time to do inspections. Okay. And it gives you the obligation, I would call it the obligation, to find out what the condition of the home is.
And by the way, I think that's pro buyer.
I think it's pro buyer as well.
I think that's pro buyer because now the buyer has a document that they can actually go back and they can check. I like that. We've done our 30 minutes.
Well, hot dang.
That's amazing.
Let's go get some coffee, Jay.
Let's fill those cups. Let's go get those former czar mugs there.
Well, folks, I hope this was informative.
No, it was great. No, this was great. I mean, I don't think people understand how certain elements of the contract really work. And I think these are just some areas that people need to understand. It really is protecting the buyer.
And just a PSA, you're not required to know this stuff. That's why you want to work with a professional. When I go to a doctor, I don't know what they're talking about. I know they're good at what they do, and I take their judgment. If I'm curious about something, I educate.
Right. Yeah. So tell people how they can get a hold of you.
Well, I appreciate you doing that. You can always find us on the Linda Craft Team website. Look me up. You can send me an email, tony@lindacraft.com. I'm on YouTube. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. My name is Anthony Fink legally. I'd love to friend anyone and add to my professional network. So just look me up, hit me up, and let's
not forget about the Fink Funny on Wednesdays.
Oh, you're right. So one of the extreme obligations and joy of becoming a father is the ability to tell dad jokes. So every Wednesday there is the Fink Funny. It's going on its 5th year, Jay, without repetition, except for the Hall of Shame. And the Hall of Shame are the classic have to be repeated dad jokes. So you can find those on Instagram. You can find those on LinkedIn.
Perfect.
Or not LinkedIn, Facebook.
Facebook. Well, thank you for this. This has been great.
Appreciate the invite. Thank you very much to the audience for your time.
Yeah. Hey, listen, you had a lot of choices. You chose real estate right now. We really do appreciate it. Thank you all over the world for watching the show. As I say to you everywhere, all over the world, you know what that is? Ciao, everybody.